Good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where you are, and welcome to the next in the Knoca learning calls. This learning call is taking us back a little bit in time to the first two climate assemblies that were run on that were run specifically on climate, and not that being part of the agenda. I want to remind you that this is being recorded and it will be used as a learning resource for the network. I'd also like to introduce my colleague Lise Deshotel, who will be co-hosting this evening with me. We are delighted if people put comments and questions in the chat, and Lisa and I will try and keep up with that and bring those comments into the conversation. It's really interesting time because it was a year ago, just over a year ago, that both the UK and the French climate assemblies delivered their reports. And so we've actually got an opportunity to think about the impact of those. And it was about a year ago, just over a year ago, or 2 years ago, that the French Convention started its work. And still there are some people in this meeting who still probably feel a bit scarred from that process, but that's another issue. Just a reminder, because many of you will know, but just in case, the French Convention was commissioned by President Macron. It had 150 members who met over 7 weekends, plus a couple of online sessions during COVID, between October 2019 and June 2020, and had an additional review session in February 2021. And they were tasked with answering the question about how France can cut greenhouse gas emissions by at least 40% by 2030, compared to 1990, in a spirit of social justice. In the end, they produced 149 draft laws, regulations, and 3 referendum proposals. And because it's worth bearing in mind, because of the comparison we're bringing here, it did that all on a budget of around 5.5 million euros. Climate Assembly UK happened at the same time. They were both in operation at the same time. It was different in that it was commissioned by parliamentary select committees. It had 108 members. It met over 4 months between January and May 2020, over 3 in-person weekends and 3 shorter online weekend sessions. And they had a similar kind of question, which was, how can the UK reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050? It produced a report with over 50 recommendations, and had a much smaller budget of around 620,000 euros. And so that is our topic of the evening. I'm going to hand over to Lise just to tell us a little bit about exactly what we're going to be talking about tonight.
Thanks, Graham. So tonight we'll be talking about all scars, as you said. No, sorry. But tonight, and as those of you who are familiar with those kind of learning calls that we organize, we've decided to have a presentation a slightly bit different from the ones we organize on Scotland's Climate Assembly in August, or the German Climate Assembly in September. For this event, we were looking back at Climate Assembly UK and the CCC. And I apologize already for the use of the acronym, but it's way easier to say CCC than the French Citizens Convention for Climate. So we're, as Graham said, more than a year after the publication of the reports. And we've seen many great events and discussions and publications being shared, organized, to share the insights on their organization, on their governance, on their outputs. And we believed it was actually maybe interesting for us to try to connect the 2 ends of the spectrum, looking at the works that happen ex ante, the process, and the one that happen ex post. That, of course, does not mean that we will absolutely avoid mentioning anything that happened during those processes. But we hoped we could use this comparative approach, and with the help of the 6 speakers we're going to introduce for this event, we were hoping we could examine the genesis, the preparation of those processes, and the follow-up they've had to date, and try to compare them and see what distinguishes the two processes. So our intent is really to try to shed some light upon how expectations and the preparation can be connected to the results and the impact those processes can have, and to draw lessons for future practice. And here I'd like to maybe thank the support of Jane Carrick and the management group of Knoca, as we will from now on try to write down elements of the key elements of the discussions we will have and try to publish them on the website, something we have not done so far, but we will try to do for future events and this one. So let me first introduce you the two first speakers who can join us on this virtual scene. The first one, let me introduce Sarah Allen. Okay, Priscilla is appearing, but Sarah will be joining us. So Sarah, you are the Director for Capacity Building and Standards at Involve, UK's public participation charity. Your role is focused on building the capacity of public servants and practitioners to develop the body of evidence, principles, and standards that support participatory and deliberative practice. And even though you have worked at local levels and on some specific issues like mental health or building safety, your work has included a number of high-profile citizens' assemblies in the UK, including, so first and foremost, the one that brings you here tonight, the Climate Assembly UK, but also the National Assembly for Wales and the Citizens' Assembly on Social Care. And you were also the design and facilitation lead for the Citizens' Assembly on Brexit in 2017. Everything's true there?
It's true, yeah.
Perfect, welcome with us. So Priscilla, let me introduce Priscilla Ludowski. Priscilla, you are one of the founders of the Yellow Vest movement. In 2018, you published an online petition about the need for lower taxes on essential goods, the implementation of the Citizens' Initiative referendum, lower pensions and salaries of elected officials. It gathered more than 1 million signatories as a movement entered the political scene in France. And you were also a member of the Citizens' Vest group that co-authored the call for a citizens' assembly to be held in France to work on the implementation of a popular initiative referendum on tax justice and green transition. And as such, you have been among the people that negotiated and prepared some key settings of the French Citizens' Convention for Climate. Everything's true as well here?
Yes, perfect. Thank you, Lisa.
Okay, then I'll just pass on the mic to Graham, who will ask the first round of questions. Be ready.
Okay, so thank you so much, Priscilla and Sarah, for joining us this evening. And we thought we would try and get initially some insights about the genesis of the processes, because I think what's really striking to me is how different the ways they emerged were. So if you don't mind, I'll start with the first one, which was the French one, Priscilla. So what were the factors in, and Lisa's mentioned some of these already, but what were the factors that were instrumental in the creation of the convention in France?
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Yes, Graham, actually, when I've launched my petition, what Liz said about the goal of the petition itself was true, but what it goes fast after is the fact that this petition wasn't considered by the government. So reading it, sharing it, debating on TV show, explaining why it is important for us to rethink the way the politicals are built wasn't heard, actually. And very quickly, the subject of the democracy, how we do measures, how we work with politics, how we propose some measures as a citizen, because what the petition shows is that even you have millions of people signing, you don't succeed in reaching the institutions. What kind of tool we have that works, actually, that make it possible for us to change things as a citizen without having to engage in a political party or in an NGO or whatever organization we think about. And this is the beginning of the reflection about how we can do it, how we can participate. And very quickly, we proposed to the Ministry of the to the Ministry of the Ecological Transition to create a citizen assembly. First of all, to debate about all the claims that the Yellow Vest movement was talking about in different groups and mainly in social media groups. For example, by the beginning of December of 2018, we proposed to people connected on Facebook, for example, a survey to ask, are you against or for the creation of a citizen assembly? And we had very quickly exactly 64,751 people saying yes for that, and against 3,027 people saying no. This was for us like an indication that we need this kind of tool. And quickly we had the question of the citizen, the referendum on citizen initiative, which had been also rejected by the ministry, saying that this is anti-democratic. So all this debate, this was, for me, I think this was the first time we had this kind of subject debated all day long on TV show, but at this moment of the year. Talking about democracy in movement was very rare, actually. You have a lot of organizations that had built advocacies for that for years and years, but to be heard very loud and to have TV shows talking about that was very surprising.
So how did you get from that discussion, which was very much social movement and media, to actually the president agreeing to run a climate convention? How did that? So is that coming from the Yellow Vests as well? Coming from
the first step was to ask the ministry to transmit this claim to the first ministry, the prime ministry, or to the president, but it had been rejected first. This was at the end of November of 2018. And then some of this kind of organization I was talking about who defend those kind of democratic tools came to us. This organization is called Démocratie Ouverte, which is in English, Open Democracy, which decided to make people join, people that usually do not work together, people from the Yellow Vest movement, people from the climate movement, researcher, and journalists, and say, okay, we fight for this for years. We should create a collective, which is actually the Citizen Vest, and who decided to ask to the president at this time the creation of a citizen assembly to debate about climate, democracy, for deep transformation of the system actually, and then to taxation. And this was in January 2019, and the president answered in April of 2019, not very a long time after the demand actually. It was through open letter in the newspapers. And then you had several steps to meet the team of the ministry and to negotiate some of what Liz was talking about, which she called case, and that we called basic methodologies to make it successful, or the most successful possible, this kind of big assembly. I don't know if you want me to talk about this four basic methodology now, or if I do it after.
I think we don't. I mean, we're limited on time, I'm afraid. But
okay.
what I'm trying to understand here is is that this came from social movements, basically. This was kind of a pressure from social movements.
Yes, and I think it was it was a surprise, I think, for the government that this kind of claims, talking about democracy, deeply transformation, is a very grassroots demand, but not really weighted.
No, I think it's really amazing, because actually, Sarah, that seems to be a very different story to what happened in relation to the United Kingdom. So, by the way, Lise, we call ours Cork sometimes. So our shortened version is Cork. So anyway, so do you want to tell us a little bit about, Sarah, about how the UK Assembly emerged?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's probably two parts to the story, one of which I know really well and one of which I can only guess at. So the part of which I know really well is that in 2018, we ran something called the Citizens' Assembly on Social Care for 2 parliamentary select committees. And that was the first Citizens' Assembly that Parliament had run. And that was funded using the Select Committee's research budget, I think that's the right name for it, which at the time I think amounted to something like £60,000 a year. And they put all of that budget towards Citizens' Assembly. And then we found an equivalent amount of match funding from charitable funders to run the Assembly. So after that Assembly, which they'd seen as a success, they increased that budget to around 120,000 to allow them to kind of fund the Citizens' Assembly at the same scale in future. So that meant that there was this budget sitting there. So, the budget's there. So a call went out, who would like to use this budget for a Citizens' Assembly? And the clerk of the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Committee saw the call and thought, well, I wonder about one on climate. And he talked to the Select Committee chair, and they were keen. And then they sort of brought in the chairs of the other Select Committees, the clerks of the other Select Committees. This is my understanding of what happened. Now, I assume that as well as that, there was lobbying of the Select Committee chairs around the idea of a climate assembly. We weren't lobbying them, but obviously XR, one of its demands is for a Citizens' Assembly. Now, I don't think that was as public at the time those discussions with the Select Committee chairs started as it was afterwards. And I know the clerk, the beige clerk, said he hadn't heard of XR's demand at this point, but I assume that the politicians probably had. And so there's probably something else that meant that the kind of the initiative of the clerk, if you like, met a warm political response.
Okay, but what's interesting here is that there's a kind of political opportunity in Parliament, whereas the other one is kind of like the president feeling pressure to actually act on that. I think that's a really interesting distinction.
Two other things just quickly mention. I know we're short on time, but just to say that I think this idea of a precedent in the UK Parliament, this idea of precedent is really important. So the fact that one happened before was important. And then also, I think we've been talking about this idea of Citizens' Assembly on climate, and then the UK legislated for a new climate target of net zero emissions to 2050, and that gave the Assembly a focus, if you like.
I'm sure you were in there a little bit yourself, Sarah, suggesting they could do something, but you won't. You probably don't want to say too much about that.
I'm not sure I was on this one, actually.
Oh, okay.
This one.
I'm kind of interested, Priscilla, just to get a sense before I hand over to Lise about whether or not the expectations of the activists were realised in the actual assembly that emerged. It seems to me that, for example, the fact that a governance committee was created, which you had a role in selecting the people on it, actually meant that in many ways your agenda was responded to by the actual assembly, or do you look at it and think actually that's not what we asked for?
Sorry, the fact that the president only answered to one of the third demands is just a partial answer first, and the fact that its commitment later hasn't been respected at all actually by the end, it's another, for me, a sign that it's not what we were expecting. The main demand within the US movement, I mean, was really the two other subjects, and I think he knew that, the taxation, of course, and what turns around social justice, and what turns around democracy.
It's an interesting question about whether he thought doing the climate one was an easy way out, and actually he may not have expected what he was getting the other end of it. And maybe that's something we can talk a bit more about. And Sarah, do you feel that what you delivered was what the commissioners were expecting? Did you feel any tensions between what you were expected to be doing in the UK and the kind of what the committees wanted to see?
No, I don't think so. I think we designed the Assembly quite carefully around the brief given to us by the committees.
Okay, well, that's really helpful. Okay, so I've set a scene in terms of the genesis. We've got this idea very much that one's come up from this sort of social movement background, another comes from the UK one comes from a sort of more of a parliamentary initiative. I just want to hand over to Lise, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the things that were put in place to think about impact.
Thanks, Graham. Maybe my first question will be for Priscilla, because I was not there at the time, but I understand that in the negotiations with the Élysée, so with the president's team, there were many discussions about this final session for review. How did you come up with this idea, and what was your intent with it? Maybe you want to explain a bit the process there?
You mean the last session?
Yes, the one we've had in February.
Actually, this was called for her the answer to the answer. The first answer was actually the providing of the 449 exactly the number of the measures they provided the members, and it was important for us to make it possible for the people who provide this work not just to leave after that, but to receive an answer, an official answer from the government. Maybe it's not enough, only one return, but it was necessary to have this debate, at least with the team of the president, to explain why those measures, to explain what they expect with these measures, which is actually because this moment was important for them, because they said, this is not just one measure and one measure and one measure. This is a project, and they wanted to make it louder for people to understand that this is a project and we cannot just analyze one measure alone. And this is an important moment to also make the president reconfirm its first commitment to apply this project. This is the intention we had with this answer to the answer process. But this is not something that they rejected, the members. They didn't say it was a bad idea or not. They just were very maybe thankful the fact that that can be possible to rediscuss with the team after having provided such a work. We can imagine different way to improve this kind of process, I think, but this is a good tool for me, I think.
Thanks. Thanks for sharing that. And it's true that the members, this was part of the very first package negotiated with the president, and as it was a part of the mission letter that was delivered by the Prime Minister for the Governance Committee to act on. And so never was this review session questioned. And I'm turning to Sarah. Was there anything foreseen before the process even began to have discussions between the members and the members of the select committee? Or did you plan anything, or did you invent something once the process ended?
So it's probably a two-part answer to that. So what we ended up doing was an anniversary event 1 year on from the Assembly, where a lot of the Assembly members came to Parliament, were able to meet the chairs of some of the committees and some wider politicians as well for the first time, as well as some of the stakeholders who've been involved in the process or influenced by it. So that's what we ended up doing. I think the whole relationship between the committees and the Assembly was slightly thrown by the fact that there was a snap election just after the Assembly was commissioned. So we received the brief, we started working on it, And then between receiving the brief, like kind of very early in that, before the first weekend, the election happened and the committees were dissolved. And the committees weren't back in their new form until just before the first, I think the day before the first weekend started. I think that's right. And so that affected a lot of things. So it's affected our ability to brief the committees properly that was happening, get them involved in the process, invite them to the kind of initial weekends, and to really work with them like that, to kind of work through how the assembly members, you know, could come and meet them and at what points. And then of course the pandemic hit, so then plans to kind of, oh, we'll do that later, we'll invite them to the later weekends to meet the assembly members in person, and then we'll bring the assembly members to meet the committees in person, couldn't happen, which is why we ended up with an event 1 year on instead. So it definitely wasn't ideal, and it wasn't what we would have done had it not been for the election and for the pandemic.
Maybe I'm gonna jump here to we already start to have some very interesting questions, and for you, Sarah, this one from Elodie Jacquet from the Simon Fraser University Center for Dialogue. How would you build the capacity of parliamentarians to receive measures or recommendations from citizens' assembly and to provide an adequate response? We've seen two processes and how different they were, but now that you've been through that and many citizens' assemblies, do you come up with a doctrine, or do you think there is an easy answer to that question?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think two things to say to it. So the two citizens' assemblies had very different impacts, which I think in and of themselves is very interesting. So the first citizens' Assembly on Social Care, was commissioned to directly inform a specific inquiry that the committees were running. Now, there were other drawbacks to that, like we got 3 weeks to prepare it, but it did mean that there was something kind of very clear, direct route to influence, and a lot of the recommendations of the Assembly were picked up, I'd say, kind of the vast majority of them, and the main thrusts of the report as well, in the report that was launched as part of that inquiry. So it had a really big impact on the committees. The impact of Climate Assembly UK, there was a much less direct process. It was the promise from the committees was to run more specific inquiries afterwards, picking up some of the recommendations that the assemblies made. That was the promise beforehand. There wasn't anything more than that. It was about kind of influencing their agenda. So that is obviously a much less clear route. There's something about, in response to these questions, there's something about what the process is beforehand and to influence decision making, what the promise is, and how that's all set up. I think also in response to that, something that we're doing now, so we're just starting a big project on public engagement on climate with local authorities, and in there's an inbuilt training component, so that the authorities have to go through a training process with us before we support them to run the practical engagement. And I think there's something about that, something about us looking at, you know, can we support people to think through kind of some of the key questions around the engagement, make sure they're aware of the different types of citizens, some of the different ways of doing it, the different ways it could link back into decision making. Is there more of that could be done up front? I think that's much harder in a parliamentary context than it is in a local authority one, particularly if it's coming from the committees, or perhaps it's as difficult everywhere, but, you know, the committees, something that we've definitely found is that you know, they like to operate by consensus where they can. They're cross-party bodies, and, you know, even if a chair is very in favour of something, or a chair and some of the committee members are very in favour of something, they're kind of reluctant to push too many things that are controversial to other members. So it's a very it is a very political environment, and the kind of the opportunities to do that learning with the politicians themselves as opposed to officials are perhaps limited, but it's definitely something that I've thought about since, and I think if we were to work with Parliament again, something I'd want to give some more thought to.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. It's very important, and thanks for answering this question, and maybe actually connecting it to another question we've just discussed, the place for parliamentarians connected to those processes, and somehow how you keep them on board and how do you make sure they follow up on that. But Felix Nasser from the German Climate Assembly was asking Priscilla if you could maybe elaborate on also how civil society organizations, and especially your movements, the Citizens Fest, how did you remain involved in the process? I think it's maybe interesting here to elaborate on the place you've had, on the role you've had in the governance committee there.
Yes, we had several different action we could do. In the collective, we have several members who got involved in the organization committee, who has been in the group of the warrant people. We had 3 warrants, and some of us stayed just in the collective, being careful of what was doing the medias, what was, we tried first to contact some public medias to make them talk about the assembly, and the fact that this assembly was a very first national initiative, very important to be spread in some TV channels. This was one of our 5 Ks setup. And this was the most difficult, actually. This is the most difficult claim we had to make it possible for public media to talk about the assembly. So some of us was keeping in touch with some journalists for that, and we succeed to obtain some papers, at least. Some of us could observe directly in what we called the third assembly of France, and which was in charge of the organization of this session of workshop from the members of the assembly. And I was thinking about another question in the chat, but maybe I can answer after. But this kind of action we could participate in this kind of action, actually.
Okay, thanks, Priscilla. We're actually saving some questions maybe to round up for the end of the discussion. So at this stage, I'll first thank you both. You'll be back in a while, but we're moving to our second panel of speakers. And Graham, this is for you. You're muted.
I had to do that. I have to do something wrong. I have to do something wrong in every call. So thank you so much, Priscilla and Sarah. And I'd like to, I'm going to be joined now by Michelle and Becky. Michelle Colombier is the co-founder of the think tank IDRI, which is the Institute for International Relations and Sustainable Relations based in Paris. He's now head of its scientific council. He was a member of this famous governance committee of the CCC, and he co-authored an analysis of the proposals of the CCC, which was called the Citizens Climate Convention, 149 Measures for a New Vision of the Transition. And I am going to ask him how many have been implemented, and he's going to avoid it, but that's another issue. And Becky Willis is a professor in practice at Lancaster Environment Centre, and she's an expert. She was one of the expert leads for the Climate Assembly UK. She's author of Too Hot to Handle, which is the democratic challenge of climate change. And she leads a new project called the Climate Citizens Project that investigates how we can transform climate policy from something that happens to people to something that happens with people. So a very nice little strap line there, I think. Well done, Becky. What's interesting about these 2 processes is that the French one was very much producing a whole set of laws, regulations, referendums, which in many ways, given what the president had said, people were expecting to be, if not implemented, to have significant influence. And the output from the UK Assembly was very much aimed at the work of a parliamentary committee. So we must recognise that they're very different beasts. But if I can start with you, Michelle, what do you think the main impacts have actually been of the process? So we had these kind of 149 recommendations come out. We had this large report come out. What have been the main impacts on political institutions and on climate policy itself in France?
Well, so I need to find an impact. That's the question.
So if you ask you a simpler question, which is 149 recommendations came out, what's happened to them?
I think I think there are two ways to answer the question, because those proposals, it's important to highlight that those proposals were not just proposals on how it should be in 2030. They were proposals on what the government needs to do right now to get any chance to eventually get there. So they were somehow conflictual also in the process, because they were very practical proposal to implement right now. And so this proposal went to the government and then to the parliament. And in terms of number, you can argue whether the government would say that most of these proposals have been implemented or under implementation, and other evaluation are that most of these proposals have been completely watered down because they have been redrafted and changed, first by the administration and second by the parliament. So in purely practical terms, what's left from these proposals, you can argue that very little was left at the end in the law somehow. But I think it's not the right way to look at it, because I think what Priscilla said is very important. Where does this convention comes from? It's a social movement. And I think the most important question is to what extent in political terms it has changed something in France. I mean, I'm working on environment, and obviously the environmental outcome is important, but the more important point is the political outcome. And so I think the question is, what was the added value of this set of proposals? And to me, having not participated, but observed the work by citizens, etc., there were mostly three added value in this set of proposals. One, basically, they did not invent completely new ideas. Obviously, I mean, the basic solutions on buildings, on transport, etc., were there. But the question was about how to implement this with social justice. And basically, they had responded with three type of proposal. First thing was to propose specific ways, specific manners to accompany, to deliver specific objectives. So it could be acceptable, or even it could be attractive for people that we implement those measures. So it was a way to invent new ways of doing politics. The second type of added value, and Priscilla mentioned this, was to say what is important is measures bound together in a systemic approach of what makes sense from a social perspective and from a societal perspective. And from an expert point of view, you can discard this proposal and this proposal, saying it's not, there's no value, it's not very efficient or whatever. But what matters is the totality of measures. And the third dimension, I think it was very important, and the citizens say this, it was to make a judgment on acceptability of certain proposal that experts or politicians could consider that they would not be acceptable by people. But after deliberation, citizens said, yes, we do think this is acceptable. It's our judgment on social acceptance. So three different manners of suggesting a different approach to acceptance or attractiveness of policy. And I think where we made progress or not, one point of progress is certainly that the situation have evolved a bit with the politicians. They were completely opposed to this new, this surge of a strange object like the citizens, and they were considering that it was their area, making politics, doing laws, etc., etc. And we had a clear rejection, no interest at all from the politicians at start. I think we have made some progress, maybe not with all of them, but we've made some progress on this discussion in France. On the other hand, the fact that President Macron and the administration and then the Assembly has discarded a number of proposals on the basis that they would not be acceptable for the people is precisely, to me, a political error, because it was precisely the motivation of the convention was to ask a judgment to citizens. And if you discard this judgment on the first step, when you receive those measures, I think it kills somehow the idea and the credibility of the idea. So my judgment is a bit in between. Yes, we have made progress. It's less black and white in the French discussion now on the possible role of citizens, etc. But the process itself was not very positive because of this, the way it's been discussed. And I think we had too much emphasis on the measures themselves, you know, the technicalities of the measures, etc., and not much discussion on what is the value of this package created by citizens, what it brings to our common understanding of the transition, and how we should learn from that in the way we make politics. And this, I think we should still discuss this dimension, which to me was the major added value of the convention.
So is it fair to say that for many politicians in France, their way about thinking about climate, their way about thinking about citizen engagement has actually shifted because of the convention?
I think at least it's they have heard an interrogation. I cannot say that it has shifted for everybody, but that they've heard an interrogation. They've understood that there's a possibility, well, the way it's been implemented now with the new assembly, etc., I think it's not the right way, but they have understood that you can have something coming from citizen proposal that makes sense in the political process and that is not competitive, but that can be contributive to the way democracies are working today. A number of people have understood this, not everybody, but I mean, it's new in the French process. And it was not at all the case. I can tell you when we started the discussion, they had no interest to come in the citizen convention. But you mentioned the stakeholders. It was the same with the private sector, for instance. At start, they had no real interest in the convention, and they came just communicating on their action on climate, etc., etc. And they started to mobilize very late in the process when the proposals came to the parliament, and not during the convention, which was strange.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And am I right in, I've heard that a number of regional mayors have also picked up, or regional leaders have picked up from the assembly and actually started running their own processes as well. Is this right?
There have been a number of regional citizen assembly also with different design and different type of organization. But yes, it's been also organized at local level, regional level, more or less inspired by this convention or other conventions elsewhere in Europe also. Yeah.
Well, that's really interesting, Michel. So Becky, obviously the ambition of the climate of Cork was Climate Assembly UK was different in the sense they weren't delivering potential laws and regulations and things. But I'm interested to know the extent to which you think there has been impact on, first of all, the committees who commissioned it, but then also other actors in the political space. I understand, for example, that the Climate Change Commission has been affected by it. So I'm kind of interested to know what you think the impact has been of on the political system.
Thanks, Graham. Yeah, can you hear me okay? Yeah, great. So it's a really interesting question. It made a big difference, the fact that this process was commissioned by Parliament and not government. And in the UK, we have the system where, basically, if a government has a decent majority, it can do what it wants, and it sort of separates itself off from Parliament almost. And so that meant that the route from the Climate Assembly into government was more problematic than in France even. Having said that, I think that the Climate Assembly had probably more impact than I had anticipated with politicians and certainly with the wider policymaking community. So, to take those in turn, in terms of politicians, I think that it really built politicians' awareness, and we actually saw individual politicians sort of, especially those who came to observe the assembly, sort of develop their thinking from starting off with maybe a position that, well, what do we need an assembly for? We're the assembly, we're Parliament. through to actually realizing that it wasn't a challenge to their authority, but a way of developing sort of better intelligence and better understanding of where the public are at than they could get from their own routes into people. That wasn't uniform at all, and I think that different politicians, depending partly on their own politics and partly on their own outlooks, I think it did differ a bit, and we can talk about that. But you definitely saw politicians sort of beginning to understand the use of these processes as to improve the working of Parliament and improve the democratic process. I think for wider stakeholders, a similar thing happened where definitely for some of the campaign groups, the Climate Assembly was a bit of a challenge because they didn't want as a campaign group, you don't want your own sort of very clear-cut campaign to be maybe undercut by what people are saying through the Climate Assembly. And, a bit of a worry about, what happens if you open this up to dialogue? What if people don't agree with us? And I think, again, there was a real sort of learning process happened amongst the sort of climate policymaking community more generally. Firstly, because as happened in France and the UK, and as has happened in local processes, once you take people through a process of deliberation about climate change, they come up with really sensible answers, right? That is a pretty solid finding. And the second thing is that it actually gives you a really good understanding of where, the challenges that we know we'll face. So some of the findings around transport, for example, in Climate Assembly were, that we really need to go hard and fast in terms of vehicle technologies because we want to leave essentially as much freedom to drive as we can. I mean, that's slightly oversimplifying the answers, but you could see how you can see how people's preferences emerge quite strongly, and you can see. And another example is that there was a lot of concern around some carbon removal technologies and around nuclear power, actually. And so those are important findings because it means that if you do want to go ahead with policy for carbon removal or nuclear, you need to take those concerns really seriously and, confront them head on, work out a way through, or decide another route. And so it's a way of sort of identifying those potential bumps in the road, potential flashpoints, and dealing with them before they become sort of huge headlines, protests, whatever that might be. So I think people did really start to understand the use of these processes from that point of view. And I think that kind of that general understanding of what happens if you involve people in policy making and in serious deliberation, I think that is a really important lesson. Maybe more so than how the findings have been used directly, although there are some really good examples of how those findings have been used directly. And as you said at the start, notably by the Climate Change Committee, who are the government's own independent advisors on climate, who used it really widely in their recommendations to government about how the UK should meet its statutory climate targets.
That's really helpful. So I'm going to ask you a question which we were asked in the, I can't remember who asked it in the chat, which is, if you had your time again and you were designing for, how would you design? Would you change anything about the way that the commitments were established, or the way that the process was designed, in order to try and enhance the impact that it had? So Michelle, what if you could be on the governance committee again, knowing what you know now, what might you do to try and enhance that impact? You're on mute. You're copying me. Very easily done.
Sorry. First, I think I would challenge the mandate of the Assembly, because I see a number of questions in the chat on the capacity for citizens to understand all the science and to understand all the options and to have the scenarios, etc., etc. And it's clearly challenging to have this on a broad agenda, like how can we reach 40% reduction by 2030? And the answer for us was to break down into smaller groups. But then you miss part of the dynamic of this big group, of the diversity of the people you have there. And so we had a challenge between trying to answer on all issues at the same time and also keeping the diversity of people. And the deliberation capacity of these people comes from their diversity, young people, old people coming from everywhere, et cetera, different parts of society. So I think this is the first element that is extremely important. The second one, I think, is that, I mean, if we would to do this again in France, we could be much more specific on what can be expected as an outcome. Priscilla said, I mean, we were in the middle of crisis, and in the middle of this crisis, the promise by Macron was not feasible. I mean, this promise to just implement this without filter, the way it was said, was not even constitutional. So it was clear for everybody that there was a trick at the end. It was a necessity. And I think that if we know this in advance, the way we formulate things and the way we then accompany the life of these proposals in the political process could have been completely different. So we would not do things in the same manner, I think, on the second assembly. Well, I think these are the most important differences.
Same question for you, Becky, because I was really impressed by, after the assembly, there were lots and lots of meetings with policymakers and with various, and I know they did that in France as well. I'm just wondering whether you think there could have been, and no way am I saying that Sarah and you did a bad job at all. I'm just wondering if you had your time again and you had time, because you had to rush really fast to get here. If you had your time, would there be particular work you would like to see that could potentially enhance impact?
Yeah, so I mean, really similar thoughts to Michelle, actually, that if I was involved in it again, I would want two things, and I'm not sure the extent to which there are trade-offs between these two things. So one of those things is, as Michelle said, to have a much clearer route from the Assembly back into Parliament and ideally government, and for, as Sarah was saying, much more sort of to and fro, much more interaction between politicians and the citizens. So, much more sort of closely coupled with decision makers. That's one thing. The other thing is to have a wider remit to get the citizens more involved in designing the question and or how the sessions run, to do some more of a sort of bottom-up work, so that so that it's actually a sort of co-designed process. Now that's probably more expensive and takes longer, but I think that you get some really interesting thoughts through there. For example, on the state of politics, the role of vested interests, the relative role of cities compared to the national government. All those kinds of things come up spontaneously from people's discussions, but they're quite hard to channel into the process that's already been designed. Now, the question on my mind is, can you have both of those brilliant things? So if you are involving, senior politicians a lot more closely, they're going to want to control it more closely, right? And those tricky questions are less likely to be part of the mandate. And they'll be more hesitant about doing more kind of bottom-up citizen-generated stuff. So I think it's not necessarily a trade-off, but I think that that's something we really need to be aware of. And I think actually Scotland is really interesting for that, because they did have a wider mandate and it was more closely tied into the Scottish government. But I suspect that's partly a quirk of Scottish politics, whereby Scotland is being run by a party that is in opposition to the United Kingdom government. So the Scottish government acts as a sort of mini pressure group in the same way that some of the US states act as pressure groups on the at the federal level. And so maybe in Scotland they managed to do those two things because of the quirk of their politics.
I'm not Susie Townend's on this call. I'm not sure she'd be happy to be called that Scotland be called a pressure group, but we'll leave that to one side. I think it's really interesting tension you brought out. At least wants to jump in and ask something before she moves on. So you're taking up your time, Lise.
It's actually you just tackled what I wanted to discuss here. So maybe I'll just use this opportunity to ask one question for Michel. And sorry, it's maybe a tricky one, but it also resonates with the question from Erika. This one comes from David Howell with the BirdLife in Can Europe. Is asking whether climate assemblies should be given an annual or biennial frequency, so that we really integrate this process in a more long-term reflection and trying to connect it to the ratchet and review process of the Paris Agreement and the commitments of member states. How do you feel about that idea of signing up for more climate assemblies in France, Michel? It's a tricky one, because I also maybe need to state here that for the organizers and the people around them I was part of, after the assembly ended, we really felt like something was closing and that we would probably not get an opportunity to have another climate assembly in France. But let's ask this question more theoretically. And I think the question is coming from Spain, because Spain actually wants to integrate in the long term this process.
I think there are two dimensions in the question. The first dimension relates to what we've discussed just now. I forgot to mention that the citizens, because their work was somehow terminated, decided to create a small NGO, an assembly, their own Assemblée citoyenne, just to ensure the follow-up of the discussion with the parliament and with the government. And so I think there's a question whether this citizen assembly, whether their work ends with the delivery of proposals, or whether their work ends after the political process has ended and delivered. And I think this is extremely important, because as I said, I think that the value of their proposal is not just on the text of the proposal per se, but on the deliberation and the capacity to convince on this deliberation. And so the capacity of this convention to really live and follow up until the delivery of action, I think is extremely important, and it was not the case. And so they organized themselves, the French citizens, to do this on an NGO basis somehow. Then should we reconvene a climate convention every 2 years, and should we reconvene the same climate convention? Well, I think the same, it would not be possible, and I'm not even sure it would make sense. But even to the question, should we reconvene, I think it relates to another question that we had in France. To what extent this type of convention, citizen conventions, not just climate, should be convened by governments, and should be convened on a regular basis? Or to what extent it's something that should come, as it came in France first, should come from a citizen proposal? So giving citizens the capacity to create and form their own citizen convention, because institutionalizing citizen convention, I'm not sure is the right answer to this process. And to some extent, it's what's being done in France now, because they've said that our third assembly, the CESE, will organize citizen consultations, but they are some sort of cheap assembly somehow. For every discussion they have, you know, they will have a group of citizens coming to Paris and discussing the subject for a weekend or 2 days or something like this, and they call this citizen assembly, and then it's just a trademark that we have a citizen assembly, etc. I'm not sure it's the right, but it's a question mark to me. But I think that the value of the citizen assembly also is the purpose of its creation somehow. And the purpose of its creation is something that comes bottom up from the citizens. So I think we should have a process where citizens assembly can be created and then supported, because you need a budget, you need a lot of things to be, obviously, to be successful, and should be accepted by the political process, but not necessarily committed and organized by the public authorities every time.
Thank you very much, Michel. And we actually have many questions, so we might bring you on board with Becky at the very end to answer some of them. But let's move to our next speakers. And I apologize for being so late. And Graham, you can blame me for that. It's all right. So we will be joined by Louis-Gaëtan Giraudet. Louis-Gaëtan will probably appear soon. Louis-Gaëtan, you're a research fellow at CIRED, the Center for International Research on Environment and Development, and also researcher at École des Ponts. You have been a member of this group of 40 or so observers, researchers who've had access to the works of the Assembly. You have co-authored two very interesting papers on the CCC that I totally recommend. One, deliberating on climate action insights from the French Citizens Convention for Climate. It's much more focused and really presents the process and the organization of the works. While the other one, and I hope we'll get a chance to discuss it a bit, Who Are the Citizens of the French Convention for Climate, is much more focused on the attitudes within the mini public, but also in the general public and the perceived legitimacy and the perception of the Assembly by the general population. But we will just get back to this issue in a moment. And let me introduce our last speaker, Stephen Alstab. So Stephen, you're a reader in British politics at Newcastle University. You're an expert in democratic theory and practice. You're the co-editor of the Handbook of Democratic Innovation and Governance. You have been an academic fellow at both the UK and the Scottish Parliaments, and you have led research teams for the Climate Assembly UK. So COC, how do you name that, Graham? COC? It's so strange.
Cork.
Okay, not COC. Okay, I was getting worried. Sorry, after the Knoca thing, etc. So, and also a research lead for Scotland's Climate Assembly. To be more precise, on the Climate Assembly UK, you were one of the independent evaluators who were commissioned to evaluate the Assembly against established standards for Citizens' Assembly and to consider also the impact of its work in Parliament and beyond. And there is also a report for that. So welcome to the both of you. So maybe, and we've discussed the connection and the broader impact of those assemblies, but maybe one thing we haven't tackled at all is were those processes known to the wider public, because we're in this very nerdy bubble on climate assemblies, and we tend to forget sometimes what impact means and awareness can mean. So maybe I would like to start here with Stephen to ask you about the visibility and the awareness on the process that you observed in the general British population.
Thanks very much. Yeah, so we did a survey at the start of the process, at the end, and also when the report was launched. And awareness amongst the public was pretty low, and as a result, engagement with the process was pretty low. If people were engaging with it, it was primarily through radio and TV. And these trends didn't really change over time or through the process. And I know we've just been talking about the impact on policy, and that this was initiated by Parliament, but we also spoke to civil servants in the various relevant departmental departments. And they said that, you know, that they didn't feel pressure to act on it because they knew public awareness was low. So if public awareness had been better, they may have had a bit more of an impulse to act upon the recommendations. Which is a shame, because when we asked them, we asked the public, have you heard about it? No, not really. Then we sort of said, well, it's this, what do you think about it? And they're in favour of it. And they think, you know, they do want it to have an input into climate policy. Now, whether that's exactly the specific climate assembly model or whether they just would like to see public input more into decision making isn't necessarily clear, because awareness of citizens' assemblies, climate assemblies, and understanding of them amongst the public is quite low, I think. So it's hard to say whether it's the specific designs or whether it's just public input, but they are in favour, anyway, they said, of that happening. So we looked as well at the sort of media coverage that it received. And obviously previously, citizens' assemblies, similar types of processes have received very little media coverage, especially in the UK. And this one received a reasonable amount. Most of it towards the end at the launch of the report, most of it online sources. But there was a mixture. It was, especially this, as it got later on, the coverage, there was a mixture of stuff about the process and then about the issue about climate change as well. And it was increasingly positive as the process went on, but it just wasn't enough to cut through. And I think in terms of impact, this shows a sort of like a deadlock, if you like that. I think journalists will only go big on reporting on a climate assembly or citizen assembly if it has policy impact. And politicians are only likely to really act upon it if the public are aware of it and they feel pressured to do so. So there is this sort of deadlock, and it's quite hard to break that. But there was a question, I think, from Erica earlier about whether there was enough broader public engagement, and I don't think there was. And while we still need to know more about how that we can get media exposure for these types of things, I think sometimes as well we just have to bypass the media and go directly to the public. So more ways of getting the public to be engaged with the process, I think, would help as well.
Thanks, Stephen. And someone's referring in the chat to the people with climate change, and it would be very interesting to get numbers and see how much this film that has been broadcasted by the BBC recently, just after COP, has had an impact and really influences people. But I'd like maybe to turn now to Louis Gaëtan to ask maybe a similar question in terms of impact, but because when we talk about the French CCC abroad, some people are very aware of the process, and it's seen as an example of a big process that had huge awareness and support within the population. And what I find interesting is the fact that the works you've been doing is bringing a very more nuanced view on this issue that we wanted you to share with the participants today.
Yes, thank you very much. So actually, when we surveyed the knowledge of a representative sample of the French population, so knowledge about the CCC, we found like it was around 20% early in the process, and towards the end of the process, it was something around 40%. So overall, we can say that the knowledge and familiarity with the process was pretty low. And actually, there was some skepticism expressed about the process, not the very device itself, but at least how it was handled by the government. And people thought that it was just a device meant for the government to escape its responsibilities and so forth. And then there was some media coverage, and it really peaked. It both started and peaked in January of 2020 when President Macron came to meet with the citizens. And there was two sorts of media coverage. So first, coverage by national outlets, but also much coverage by regional outlets, since the participating citizens were coming from all across France. Well, regional newspapers were interested in their personal experience. So there was quite some coverage here. And actually, I have some textual analysis going on of media coverage, and it appears that much of the coverage was pretty positive about the process, except for a few very conservative outlets.
Thanks. It's super interesting. Once again, maybe it shows that it's not always about quantity, but also about quality. But this research work on the coverage and analysis has been one topic that we've discussed with Knoca in the past. Of what are the attitudes also of journalists and the media towards the processes that are a bit unique and rare. Maybe one question to Stephen, because in the report, in the evaluation you drafted for the select committee, you have come up with a couple of recommendations trying to connect, trying to improve for future processes, the implication or the involvement of the broader public. Could you maybe share some of them? And Louis-Gaëtan, be ready. If you have any ideas, I'll be happy to also get your views on that. I know that you researchers, sometimes we don't ask you that, but I'd be keen because you were very close to the process. So I'd be keen to hear that from you as well. Stephen, please.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say, and to people who actually, organize these things, is to experiment, because there's been so little done in this area that, there's try new things. We need to try new things and see what does work. But I guess really, there's things at the beginning, through the process, and at the end. So at the start of the process, you can have the public sort of suggest suggestions for the remit, for example. There is obviously then the danger that Becky's mentioned before, then that if you have a remit that isn't on the agenda of politicians, then they're just going to ignore the outcomes of it. So there are problems and limitations of all these different approaches. I think one of the best things I've seen was the very first Citizens' Assembly on electoral reform in British Columbia, where the Assembly members went back to their local areas and held public hearings to discuss the issues with them. And then that's creating that, it's not even just informing, that's creating that dialogue that they can go back and, have been influenced by their communities, as well as then the communities finding out more about what's going on and what their considerations are, et cetera, et cetera. So I think for me, that's the best thing. And I'd like to definitely something like that more. And then finally, it's at the outcomes of it, it's really trying to ensure that people are aware of what the recommendations are. But for deliberative Democrats, we want people to understand why those recommendations are being proposed as well. So I think communication strategy does come into it. Then I think whether a report is the best way of communicating those things to the public. I think they're a good way of getting things to policymakers maybe, but perhaps, and stakeholders even, but less so to the public. So I think we might need to be more imaginative in terms of the resources that we use to try and reach the public with the outcomes from a climate assembly. So maybe more digital resources. I'm not sure. Like I said, I'd encourage people to be creative and inventive there.
Thanks a lot, Stephen. And there is this discussion also in the chat where our colleagues who are planning the Austrian Climate Assembly are also mentioning the plan they have to have an involvement of citizens and stakeholders also all along. I know that in Spain there is also, there has been a call published until the 10th of December for people to help participate in a consultation to rank and prioritize the issues that will be discussed by the Assembly. So this is really the hot issue also at the moment, not only to raise awareness, but find ways to implicate and involve the public. Louis-Gaëtan, do you have any thoughts on that as well?
Yes, so maybe I'll provide an indirect answer. In the CCC, there was to me a big missed opportunity to reach out to the general public, and it was actually missed by the citizens. And I will try to keep the long story short, but they technically refused to bring their measures to referendum. I mean, they were given the opportunity by the Prime Minister to express whether they would like their proposals to be brought to referendum, and they voted against it. not without heated debates. And obviously, had this occurred, had the outcome be different, there would have been a campaign and all that based on their proposals. And I think the relationship would have been much stronger. But what's interesting is to understand why they voted this way. And there were two competing arguments in the debate. One was that if the measures were brought to referendum, the people would perhaps, because they were not as enlightened as the citizens had become, they would vote against the referendum just to express some bad feelings about the president. And I think this was likely that many people would, from the general public, would vote this way, but still having this approach, denying the people the opportunity to vote on these measures is a bit concerning, at least from a normative point of view. But then the competing argument was that many people showed some anxiety, many participating citizens showed some anxiety at the idea of having to campaign for a referendum, okay? And this raises the question as to how much the citizens should be kept in the loop, and publicly so, after the convention is over. So to what extent do we involve citizens and have them go public afterwards? And I think that's a tricky question that needs to be addressed. So clearly, more guidance as to whether a referendum should follow up or not, to me is essential, and maybe the more question of whether the choice should be given to citizens to say whether this should be the case or not is an important issue.
Thanks, Gaëtan. And I think this gives us the opportunity to look back into Sarah and Priscilla, because this referendum idea was one of the key project or vision that I think the Citizens West had at first. So thank you, Stephen and Gaëtan. Sorry, we had very little time remaining, but we'll welcome our two first speakers for a quick Q&A, even though thank you all, as usual. This is a very lively chat where people answer, and it's a bit tough sometimes to know what has been answered or not, but that is why Graham is here. He has been following that. So Graham, what else is there for us to tackle and discuss here?
I wondered what's happened to Priscilla, whether we've lost her, but have we lost her in the, anyway, we don't have as much time as I'd hoped, Sarah, because I'm sure you would have enjoyed rebutting some of the things that might have been said. But actually, for me, it's been a really interesting conversation. But Sarah, one thing I would like to ask you as a practitioner, and you've already come to this already, is what would you like to see? What would you like to see part of climate assembly practice and assembly practice more generally, in order that we can improve impact? Because that's what we, whether that's impact in the political system or impact on the wider public. What would you all sort of, if resource wasn't the problem, what would you like to see?
It's a really good question. I think probably some of the things I start with, some things are probably more resource intensive than others. So I think on the less resource intensive side of things that I think, retrospectively looking back at Climate Assembly UK, I wonder if there'd have been a way to do differently. The amount of engagement that we had with Parliament and government during the process. So you talked about kind of all the briefings we did for civil servants afterwards. We did less during it, and that's because both of those things, those parts of the relationship, were run by the select committee team kind of through the usual channels, if you see what I mean. And I wonder if, with a bit more budget, there was a sort of communications PR agency working with Parliament around the Assembly, which was incredibly effective in reaching stakeholders and the bits that they were kind of responsible for. And I wonder, with a bit more budget for them and a bit more staffing for them, whether they'd have been able to kind of build more relationships and think of more creative ways of working in Parliament government, if Parliament had been happy with that. I mean, that is a really important caveat in this particular process. But I think strategies for people and involving everyone early on is clearly important.
Is that like preparing the administration for what's coming, basically?
Yeah, to make sure they know what's coming, to make sure they feel excited about it. You know, we had some constraints. We had some constraints on observer numbers because of the size of the venue. So, like, with more budget, you could also get more of them potentially to come and observe. I think actually the location of the assembly is really important. So the French one happened, I think, in Paris. Ours happened in Birmingham, because in the UK they like to think that not everything is London centric, and these things happen outside the capital. To run it in the capital will be much more expensive, but with budget no issue, it would definitely help get more politicians and stakeholders along to it. So I think the location of the assembly is important. With even more budget, I think there's a lot more that could be done in terms of public engagement around it. There's been like really interesting talk in the chat about distributed dialogue models or community conversation models, where you kind of reach out through existing networks and groups and people to get them involved. And I think, for me, that's a really good way of doing it, because you have people who meet together, not necessarily because they're interested in climate, to kind of deal with Becky's point in the chat about kind of you'd hear from who you already heard from. But if you could see, for example, that some of the big charitable funders that have relationships with lots of community groups and people who may not normally respond would get involved and back something like that, that you could reach a lot more people and hear from them around the process and around what they thought in a way that fed in. And I think that could be really interesting.
I quite like the thing that Stephen was talking about with the British Columbia thing as well, of actually potentially having almost like hearings with assembly members in localities and things like that. That sounds like a really interesting.
Yeah, I think that's right. And one of the things that we didn't have budget for but really wanted to do was we were able to support some assembly members to do media work, and to Susie's question in the chat, have been supporting some assembly members to do media work since, but we would have loved to support kind of all the assembly members who were willing to do media, to do local media, to engage with their MPs and with their councillors locally, but we just didn't have anything like the budget or the team. So I think that's really true, and providing support for them to become kind of ambassadors and real champions of it in their community is a really good and effective way to work as well.
Sarah, that's been fantastic. I'm just going to be really cheeky and ask Lise what's her response to that, actually, because Lise was on, as some of you might have gathered, Lise was an advisor to the governance committee, so she does bear some scars, as I said at the start. And I'm kind of interested, since we've lost Priscilla, if you were looking back at the French process, what would you like to have seen that you didn't see in terms of preparing for impact?
Thank you, Graham. I have to say that it's not something, I think what I would have liked to see was the fact that in the governance committee, we had great minds, and this was also part of the deliberative experience, to have these people coming from different backgrounds have to work together, sometimes spending, and sorry, Michelle, for disclosing that, but sometimes spending 5 hours to discuss whether or not one hearing should be public or not. And we did that at a time where we had time restrictions. We only had less than 3 months to organize the works of the assembly. And I think that many of the preparation and the works we have done could have been better, especially the impact, etc., with I think more time for the preparation of the process. But it's a kind of thing where you also feel like it's a domino pile or something like that, that if you pull something off, then the rest is going to change. So maybe you should ask that question to Michel. He would be the one able, or maybe that could be another call just with Michel.
I think that maybe we're looking for another call there, but I think so. I'd like to. We're running out of time, and I'd really like to thank everybody who's participated in this call. I'd like to thank Sarah. I'd like to thank Priscilla. I'm not quite sure where she went, but we thank her. I'd like to thank Michelle, Becky, Louise Gatin, and Stephen. It's been really informative. I'm sorry it's been a rush, but I really think it was incredibly useful to actually put these two processes together, even though they were actually very different assemblies. I think we can learn a lot by looking across them. And the kinds of issues that have been brought out on the chat, I think, are issues that are really helpful for us to think about further learning calls. Before we go, I'd just like to he did nudge me. Stephen's doing a couple of calls on Thursday about comparing the Scottish and the UK assemblies. The details of that are on the Knoca event site, so please do go there. We've got a social on the 9th of December where just for the network to get together and to talk about the kinds of issues that we'd like to see developed in the future. That's available on the just as if by magic you can engage through our event site. And just as a reminder for those of you who might be applying for the knowledge development projects and also the mini grants that Knoca is offering, that the closing date for that is this coming Monday. I've had a really nice time. I've learned a lot today. It's been a really enjoyable time. Lisa, is anything you'd like to say to end?
No, just do not hesitate to write to us, because we're coming, it's going to be the end of the year. We need to come up with ideas for next year, even though we already have some processes that we would like to highlight, like the Danish Climate Assembly, for instance, or other processes. So please do not hesitate to reach out, and thanks for turning up and being so many to attend our events.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.